Yeah, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. Kia ora. And is that working? So this is one of the earlier pictures we have from the Hikurangi Repo, the Hikurangi Swamp, from the Drummond collection from 1916, an oil painting. It's part of the Whangārei Art Museum collection. I just want to say thank you to the library for inviting us and for having us talking about this exciting place. And what you expect is we're going to talk, a big chunk of it will be, we talk about the Hikurangi Swamp, Te Repo Hikurangi, but we also talk about the wider industrial and social history of Hikurangi. And in a way, it's all connected anyway. So, this is also a typical picture of the swamp in floods, as you see, a few cows roaming around. Who are we? Lisa, Glenn already said most of it. I'm an historian. I'm originally from Germany. I ended up in Hikurangi meeting my partner Lisa a few years ago. And Lisa is an artist and an educator, and we had an exhibition about the Hikurangi Swamp in 2020-21 at the Whangārei Art Museum, which also went to Wellington later on to Photospace. And doing this exhibition, doing research about this exhibition, we got involved in the museum. And I'm the chairperson of the museum now, so they never let us go again, obviously. So if you want to take over that job, you're welcome to. So that's how we started looking into the history of Hikurangi and went on a journey basically and discovered more and more layers of the history in Hikurangi and what an exciting and interesting, fascinating place it is. Before we go there, I just want to also acknowledge mana whenua of this area as the kaitiaki of the Hikurangi Swamp and the surrounding areas, and also all the people who were involved in and worked in this area before us and who are not with us anymore. And there are heaps of other people who are doing a lot of great work in this space. And I hand over now to Lisa. She will talk a little bit about the geography of Hikurangi and the Hikurangi Swamp.
Thank you. So I'm Lisa, and I don't have my notes printed out, so I apologise for reading from my laptop. So Hikurangi is 15 kilometres north of Whangārei. It's closer to the east coast than it is to the west, which is quite interesting when you think about that the catchment from Hikurangi, which is a very large catchment, drains to the west. The township of Hikurangi is overlooked by Hikurangi Maunga, which is there, and the name that we have discovered that mana whenua prefer to call it is Aratapu. Okay, so the township of Hikurangi is just nestled in beside Aratapu or Hikurangi Maunga, and you can see here to the left where I'm moving the cursor the great extents of the Hikurangi flats, which is why we know about the area as the Hikurangi Swamp or the Hikurangi Repo. Although the boundary of the catchment of the Whangārei River is less than 3 miles from the east coast of the Northland Peninsula, all runoff from the area is discharged to the Kaipara Harbour, to the northern Whangārei River, and where it discharges into the northern Whangārei River is still tidal. So the capacity of the Whangārei River above the Whangārei Rapids, where the river cuts its way through a lava flow and limestone rock, is extremely limited. So that means that consequently the lower parts of the Hikurangi Valley coarse wall pond, and there's an area of some 20,000 acres, so, which is why we have a swamp there. Just before I move on, the image that you can see on the right was actually is a polystyrene map which we have at the Hikurangi Museum. It's fascinating. It was created by the Northland Catchment Commission before the Hikurangi Flood Major Scheme was created in the 1970s, and it shows the extent of the catchment and the tributaries, but also where they propose to put pump stations in the Flood Major Scheme. So Māori and Te Repo Hikurangi. So as Thorsten mentioned, it's really important to acknowledge mana whenua. So as we know that there's two main tributaries that go into the Whangārei River, which makes its way in early documents. They talk about the tortuous flow of the river as it would wind its way across the Hikurangi Swamp to discharge to the west. There are numerous coal deposits and limestone at Waro, particularly the northern end of Hikurangi Township, and very fertile swamplands which are rich in peat. The area was largely covered with kahikatea and swamp vegetation such as rushes, Repo, Whangārei, which some people know as harakeke, and until there was milling and drainage of the area. Prior to the drainage, there were weeks at a time that the flats were underwater, and so we often hear it referred to as an inland ocean. So the catchment, there is a lot of rainfall, especially in the Puhi area up here. The swamp itself is 300 feet above sea level, and the surrounding hillsides are up to 1,000 to 1,500 feet above sea level. So 300 feet above sea level for the swamp, and then rising up to 1,000 to 1,500 for the hillsides around. And there's a lot of waterfall that comes down from Puhi. The fall between Lewis Bridge and we've been told the fall between Lewis Bridge and the state highway at Whakapara is a fall of only 30 centimetres. So when that water gets down there, it sits there. The flat land upstream of Lewis Bridge is approximately 30,000 acres, and in association with this is there's approximately 2,000 acres of valley land and tributary streams, which is also affected by flooding. The outflow, which is at Purua, is a plug. So it's a basaltic lava flow. The river itself runs over 3 volcanic cones, and the prior volcanic activity raised the rock level, which is why we have a very sluggish river. So when they started the drainage, as we'll hear more about later, that was one of the big problems, is the outfall at Purua is too small for the quantity of water that is gathered in the catchment, and hence we have a swamp. So the total inflow into the Hikurangi Swamp could amount to 27,000 cusecs. I had to look this up. 1 cusec is 28.317 litres per second. It's not so much that, but it's that when we have storms of 4 to 6 day duration, but the outflow, it can be no more than 8,000 cusecs at Purua. So you can see we have a lot of water coming in and very little water is able to get out. Okay, so backtrack. So mana whenua to Māori. We know that the area was really important to mana whenua. I just want to acknowledge some of the marae that are nearby Hikurangi. So we have Ngāti Hau have marae Akirama and Whakapara, the northern end of the swamp. And we have Ngārara Tunua, Ngāti Kahu o Toranari, towards the southern end, but we know that many other hapu are associated with the area, and I think Thorsten will talk about Ngā Kaitiaki o Ngā Waimaori later. But we know also that there were Ngāi Tahuhu, Ngāti Wai, and we know, such as Milan Roka has said from Te Urioroi, that the river connects us all. So the river itself connected people, okay? The repo was a shared resource for kai, especially tuna, eels, ika fish, and manu birds, but also building resources at Whangārei, the flax. And we are in a space where we've come into the museum, and our museum is mostly focused on European history, and so we are very much in the process of trying to find out more information. So if anyone has anything that they would like to share with us, please come and see us. We know that before we do, this map here, which was kindly shared with us from the New Zealand Archaeological Association, you can see that there's actually marked on it Māori crossing track at the base of the Maunga. So right back from 1872 in the maps, they were indicating where Māori were walking the tracks because they were looking for high ground through the Repo. We know there were multiple pā sites around the area, and again, these maps here, geological maps, if you were to come and have a closer look, there are multiple pā sites, which I won't point out all now, but there are multiple pā sites which are shown, which of course are all on the edges, not on the flat grounds themselves. We've also been advised that kumara storage pits were found on Aratapa on the Maunga, so we know that kumara was grown and harvested and stored on Hikurangi Mountain. And Lake Waro itself, which you may know for those limestone formations at the north of Hikurangi, that is a wahi tapu, so it's a burial site for Māori. So European settlement of the area. In 1862, a large block of land was purchased by the District Commissioner of Lands. And just want to say here that Hikurangi itself, when you look into its history, had some quite distinct areas. So you had settlements at Waro, you had Wilsonville, you had Hikurangi itself. So of course people settled where the work was. And you can see these houses nestled up against the limestone rocks in Waro because there was mining taking place there. The timber industry. So Europeans settled in the area from the 1860s. We know there was dense bush, and in 1870s the first timber mill by Mr. Matheson and Mr. Sissons was created. It was taken over by Mr. Buchanan, who established a 2 stories boarding house for his workers. Several other mills were established in Hikurangi. The largest was Henry's Mill, which specialised in milling kahikatea. One of the things I find really interesting about Hikurangi is that all of the industries connect. And so the timber that was cleared was then, especially the kahikatea, was used to build the butter boxes for the dairy factory because it doesn't impart a flavour to the butter. So, and then of course the coal was also used on the drainage of the swamp and for the railways. So the industries in Hikurangi were really intimately connected with one another. Once the bush was cleared, then the land was used for pasture. So coal. So we all know Hikurangi is really famous for being a coal mining township. So at the end of the 19th century, coal was discovered at the northern end of Hikurangi. And you can see this here, this Hikurangi township itself. So you can see the coal deposits in this coalfield map showing that it's at that northern end. The first mine, Keep It Dark, was opened in 1880s. That was near Waro. And that coal output was negligible until the railway was extended from Kamo in 1894 because they needed the transport. And by 1900, there were 2 large mining companies that had monopolised the industry. Something that's really important to note is that Hikurangi's, the coal production in the entire region of Northland, 2/3 of it came from Hikurangi. So it was really an important contributor to the resources of New Zealand. So 4.5 million tonnes were taken out of Hikurangi of coal. There are at least 12 official larger sized collieries, but many more smaller family run enterprises, including the site of the Ackers tragedy, which I'm sure you've heard about, where in 1933 3 brothers perished in the Black Damp. And that was a very sad day. The biggest mine was the North Shaft mine, and you can see, is that the one with the pit head?
Yes.
Yeah. And so the pit head you can see here, we've actually got one of the pit head wheels at the Hikurangi Museum, so please come back and visit us. And this mine was closed because of flooding. The last mine was closed in 1948. We encourage you to visit us and come and talk to our mining expert, Bill Black, who couldn't be here today, but he sends his apologies. Okay, so mining. So the development, sorry about the funky text, wasn't expected to do that. So the development of the town, by the 1880s, the town was really well established. There was a school, shops, 2 boarding houses, police station and a courthouse. By 1886, there was a population of 93 people. Services arrived by 1911 with a telephone link, post office, and there was a town water supply by 1914. A new school was established in 1922, and electricity became available to the township in 1937, although schemes were explored much earlier. And of course, the mines had their own power supplies. By 1924, there was a population of 1,051 people, 240 buildings in the town, 60 outside of the town in a half-a-mile distance, and 6 were being erected. And in 1926, there were 1,125 people living in Hikurangi. So it was always an independent from Whangārei, and if you compare the population to Whangārei at the time, it was actually a very sizable population. So limestone. The quarrying of limestone started at Lake Waro in 1920s, initially for building marble and then lime for agriculture and cement purposes. So you may be well aware that the Auckland War Museum and the Whangārei Railway Station both have marble or limestone from Hikurangi facing blocks in their architecture. And Wilson Quarry continues to mine the limestone, and that lime goes to Portland. And of course, lime was used for agriculture. We can see here, this is Bill Martin, so they didn't have much working on the quarry. At this point, of course, Lake Waro was a limestone quarry until it flooded. We just did a project with local school, and we met the grandson of an explosives engineer who worked on this, and he must have been a great-grandson. And so the lake, it flooded. But one of the other issues about the quarrying at Lake Waro, they were warned, of course, because nearby in the rock formations, they were used as a burial ground. So that was also controversial. And so Lake Waro is still a wāhi tapu today, and so not everybody goes there for a swim. Okay, nearby areas and industries. Just want to mention Puhi because, I know you would have heard Don Goodall talk about, and just a shout out to all of the local historians who put a lot of time and effort into their local history books, because they are really invaluable for institutions like ours. So this is the Manders Mill. And I think it's important to mention because a lot of the wood that came out of Puhi came through timber trap dams, and then a lot of that timber ended up in the Hikurangi Swamp in the waterways as what became known as sinkers or snags. And of course, they cause obstruction. So some of the timber would go over the Wairoa Falls, and you've probably seen fantastic pictures of people standing, quite scary looking pictures of people standing on those logs going over the falls. But the logs that sunk were the Priestman dredge, when it was put to task, was one of the things it was doing was removing those to remove the obstructions in the waterways. And this is a mill at Whakapara. With the swamp, you can see the flatness of the land behind. So we know that the timber industry was really big. We also know that there was the silver and mercury mining in Puhi from the late 19th century. The silver concluded in the 20s, but mercury until 1946, and it was of strategic importance because of World War II and its use in ordnances. Okay, I'm going to pass it on to Thorsten to talk about fisheries.
I thought the dairy first, but...
Oh yeah, okay.
No, it doesn't matter.
You can go back.
Do the fisheries first. Well, I do the fisheries first, doesn't matter really. So another important industry in Hikurangi was the fish factory. I don't know if you've heard the name Happy Jovic. This man here, he was a happy man because he had a lot of money in the end of his life. So he came to New Zealand from Croatia in the 1940s, and without money, without even speaking English basically, and he worked his way up, the New Zealand dream, basically, you could say, and was a millionaire in the end of his life and had a Rolls Royce. So he arrived in the 1950s in Hikurangi with his wife Esther. Esther was from Palmerston North, so she did a lot of the talking most of the time because she could speak English. And yeah, so they started a fish and chips shop in Hikurangi, and then after a while started to export fish and mainly crayfish to America, Australia, Japan, France. And they made a lot of money out of that, and it was a big employer in Hikurangi too. So a lot of people would work in the fish factory, and in 1967 they extended their company to the Chatham Islands and did a lot of fishing over there. They had their own fleet, 8 large company trawlers, 8 private trawlers, and quite a few smaller fishing boats. So it was actually quite a substantial company. They also, in 1968, they went to Germany to study eel marketing, because believe it or not, in Germany and in France, eels are actually what do you say?
Delicacy.
Delicacy. Thank you. So, and they started to sell eels to Germany and Europe. And most of the eels, of course, came from the Hikurangi Swamp. And we heard quite a few stories from people who grew up in Hikurangi. Maybe Rosemary remembers that, who were students at the time, and they were catching eels to make a bit of pocket money. And Happy Jovic was happy to give them a little bit of money for the eels and sell them on for probably a little bit more money. And yeah, so in the first 3 years when he started that business with eels, he exported 25 tons of eels, which is quite a lot. So this happened before the major drainage scheme was installed in the Hikurangi Swamp, and at that time the swamp was full of eels, so there were eels everywhere. When they were migrating, we had records, the water looked like it was boiling, but there were so many eels in the water, they tried to get to the sea. Yeah, not like nowadays anymore, unfortunately. So that's Happy Jovic. Goodbye, Happy Jovic. Hikurangi Dairy Factory, another important employer in Hikurangi. The Hikurangi Dairy Factory was founded by a group of farmers in Otonga in 1904. A benefiting factor was probably the establishing of the railway link from Whangārei to Hikurangi a few years earlier. At the start, they produced butter and roller-dried buttermilk. So they would drive around with a truck like this and pick up the cream. So they did the cream run. It was quite famous at the time. And as you see, the conditions were not really nice, often in floods, and yeah, was hard work. Over the time, with improvements of drainage, so when they started more to drain the swamp and access to the farms was a bit better, they started to pick up whole milk, so not just cream anymore, and yeah. So the numbers of suppliers and the production continued to increase over the years. And just to give you a few numbers, so when they started in 1904, they produced 40 tons of butter. In the 1950s, it was already 3,000 tons of butter, so it was quite a massive increasement. Quite interesting for the dairy factory is also the fact that they used local coal from the Hikurangi coal mines as energy source. They even had their own coal mine for quite a few years, which is quite unique because there's no other record in New Zealand about a dairy factory having their own coal mine. In 1955, they built a new building, or they completed a new dairy factory building, which is still there in Hikurangi. I don't know if you've been to Hikurangi, but where the museum is, opposite on the other side, there's the old dairy factory, and that's the building we are talking about from 1955. They put that on top of the old dairy factory building, and they kept on working the whole time, so it was quite interesting to keep on working and building a new factory, basically. Over the years, more and more dairy factories in Northland were amalgamating. And in 1985, unfortunately, the Hikurangi dairy factory had to close, and that was a big problem for Hikurangi because a lot of people lost their jobs. And after that, it was a bit of a sad time for Hikurangi, basically, because there was not much work around. So the dairy factory joined with the Northland Cooperative Dairy Factory, which is now Fonterra. And you probably all know the Fonterra factory in Kauri. That's what we have nowadays. And Fonterra is still operating in the swamp. We have a Fonterra farm just opposite where we live, and they have quite a bit of land in the swamp and a lot of work in the swamp. So what we do now is we talk in our second part of the talk. We talk mainly about the Hikurangi Swamp, and Lisa is making a start of telling us how the drainage work started. Come.
Thank you. Okay, draining the swamp. So we'll call it the swamp, even though a lot of people prefer to call it, we actually prefer to call it Te Repo. A lot of people call it the swamp. What was the need for draining the swamp? We've already talked a little bit about the geography, so you understand why it was a swamp. And we can see here some photographs. So from 1933, there's a letter from a farmer to the chief drainage engineer talking about the May flood. That's the one on the left. And the one on the right is from 1930. No, that one's a bit later. Is it Stora? Storrar? Yeah, if anyone's got questions, I'm more than happy if you put your details down, because we've got a lot more images like this that we took when we went to New Zealand, the National Archives. So really fascinating, the letters, the quantity of letters from farmers to the drainage engineers and lands and surveys departments regarding the improvement of their land and the impact of the menace of the floods, as they called it. And this image here was taken by Ivy Ringrose, actually, and that's from 1951. And we can see the flood, the falls and flood, and you've got the extent of the flooding there in 1951. So the swamp scheme had already started, but I think it still gives us, it's always good to look at these historic images to get a sense of where we've come from. Okay, early drainage works. So the diversions of the Whangārei River at the Ruatangata Falls, known as the Whangārei Rapids, were first surveyed in 1879, and as a result in 1888 settlers started purchasing land in Jordan Valley in anticipation of the drainage work starting. The start of these works were put on hold, so some work started and then the start of those works were put on hold with the start of World War I, and then commenced again in June 1919. So drainage area was designated at 50,000 acres, Initially, the work was to define the boundaries of the rateable area. So this is the drainage area designated in 1919 that you can see. There were initial meetings with the settlers, and that 50,000 acres were proclaimed as a drainage area in terms of the Swamp Drainage Act in 1915. The works proposed were the diversions and lowering of the channel, the basaltic lava flow down in the Whangārei rapids down Purua, diversions, lowering and widening of the river canal from the lava flow upstream to Purua Bridge and between Purua and Lewis Bridges. And then also some reconstruction of the Waiatu and Whakapara rivers higher up. Not all of this work was carried out. The drainage system was in the main completed as proposed, but neither the Waiatu River canal or the diversions were constructed to full size, and the diversions that were dug were only dug out to summer water levels, so they weren't sufficient. They initially created 19 overflow channel spillways, and the initial proposal was to reduce the length of the river near Whakapara through crosscuts, so they straightened the river out, and they proposed to remove it from being 29.5 miles in length at that reach of the river just to 19. So 10 miles is 16 kilometres they proposed to take out through crosscuts. You can find a lot of these maps online through Papers Past, and it's very interesting to see how all of the river has been straightened with those crosscuts. We heard from Milan that he thought it was more like 13 kilometres that had been removed. So the work started at the Purua end of the scheme in the 20s, and blasting that lava flow. So a lot of dynamite was used, and they called it shooting it out and then removing that rock. And that lava flow was considered the plug at the end of the scheme. Just want to show this. So this is the establishment of the rateable area, which was one of the first things that was done in 1919. So you can see they were already thinking about the areas and how they would rate the works in terms of the level of benefit that you received from and how you contributed to the scheme as well. In 1922, a works camp was established down near Purua on the site of Worsnips. In a lot of the letters, they were talked about he was a very difficult individual, and I think it wasn't just him in particular, but even though people wanted the works to take place, the way that it went about was not necessarily as favourable to farmers in terms of the access to their land. Some of the things, for example, with this gentleman in question who was considered an impossible individual, if you read all of the letters back, was he had considered that he would get the coal carting contract by having the works camp near his land, and he didn't get it. And then some of the issues that people had were they had the work that was being created was cutting off access to their orchards that they had. There were a lot of orchards, especially in Roa Tangata West. The straightening of the banks of the river made it impossible for the cows to get in to drink water. So they were not able to get down into the water anymore. And one of the things one of the settlers had mentioned also in that very early period was that a lot of the water that was coming down was actually quite polluted because of the water that was being discharged out of the mines. And they made a comment that actually there were a lot of eels, but the eels were actually up the further tributaries. They weren't in the main areas where the water was coming out of the mines because it was quite toxic. So 1922, that works camp was established down there. I think it's about 3 air miles from Roa Tangata West. The workers had to pay rent for their huts. There were single and married quarters. One man in married quarters had his 4 young children with him. By 1925, they were working 10-hour shifts. And just to give you a sense of how difficult the conditions could be, in 1925, in the month of May, it rained 22 days, 13 inches of rain. There was no health and safety equipment, and they just kept going. If someone might know how to pronounce this better, but 2 steam shovels were assembled in Whangārei in August in 1922, and they were walked over to the present day site where that work was taking place down near Purua. And it was the largest ever land crossing, 16 miles, 13.5 by road, and the rest was over private property. They had to erect 2 bridges along the way. It was a 5.5-day journey. The 3rd steam shovel arrived just before Christmas and got put to work. In 1922, the work had already started, but the opening ceremony took place with Prime Minister Massey and Minister Guthrie, the Minister of Lands, in the steam shovel turning over the first sod of earth, which you can see here. But of course, the works had already started. He stated at the time, so over 500 people attended that opening ceremony, and Massey stated at the time he thought that Hikurangi would be one of the easier drainage districts to drain. He predicted it should be done in 5 years' time. And he wanted to come back for the closure of the scheme, and he thought it would cost a maximum amount of £90,000, which we know is totally blown out. In 1924, there was a lot of correspondence also about wanting to get a Priestman dredge up from other drainage works in New Zealand. So one of the Priestman dredges was being retired at the Rangataiki, and so there were a lot of talking about it coming up here instead of going down to Pokawa. And those sort of letters went over years, where settlers were getting together and saying, we need this plant, this machinery to come here urgently. So it's really interesting. So as I mentioned, not without conflict. Mr. Wisnip, where the work started in Purua, he even wrote one of the people working must have got so annoyed with him, he went to plough some land and his plough had been taken to bits. Gates had been taken off the hinges. He would lock the gates. It's quite interesting to read. So the concern from settlers was impact on the access to land. Of course, getting the material and equipment across in winter would have been very difficult, and so there's evidence of people being paid out for damage to lands. Some of the settlers wrote and asked for their timber because their timber was destroyed, which was used as firewood. And of course, if they didn't have the firewood, then they had to buy coal. They used the timber, obviously the shelter bouts, for their cattle. Some settlers talked about, yes, the water was getting down faster, but it was still backing up at Purua. So really that has always been a problem. And in 1926, S. Mason talked about, he's losing an orchard of 200 trees, and there's just lots and lots of this evidence. Interestingly, the mines that Hikurangi collieries wrote in 1931 because their mine flooded, and it was because an old creek bed had a subsidence and had overflowed into the mine, which filled up. They were advised that they must pay for the drain, and it was noted that they were not landowners, and so weren't being rated for drainage works. But there was lots of this going on. By 1931, there was discussion about the costs, and again, lots of letters saying, look, if you're going to stop the scheme, then it's going to cost you this much money to dismantle the plant, so you may as well keep going. In 1936, the Land and Surveys Department left the area with no provision made for future maintenance, no money, nothing planned. And so as a result, over a period of time, the drains became blocked. So we've got here the steam shovels at work. Like I said, no health and safety equipment here. So of course, blasting the rock face and using the steam picks or the Priestman at work. And interestingly, I haven't found this written about, but them recovering the sunken Priestman. Look at that fantastic diving equipment. There were a series of floods in 35 to 36, which again caused the settlers to petition for a thorough investigation to lessen the flood menace and to complete the further development work. They realised at that point it was impossible to prevent flooding in the swamp, and they knew that taking further work between the falls and Lewis Bridge, because the land is very unstable, by deepening the riverbed there, it was actually causing more slips, and so that has actually been planted out with poplars, I understand. And so again, it was advised that they shouldn't do no more work there, and they understood that removing more rock at the rapids would have no further benefit to the swamplands. By 1953, the drains had deteriorated to such an extent that the flood condition was similar to what it was before it started in 1919. The main river canal had been overgrown with willows, and slumping of the canal had reduced their effectiveness. In 1962, the Northland Catchment Commission was formed, and in the following year, at the request of the County Council, the Northland Catchment Commission agreed to take over the day-to-day controlled works of the swamp and investigate the possibility of carrying out further major works in the area. And then between 1963 and 67, the Commission maintained and improved that drainage system, incorporating further communal drains. So I'm going to pass it over to Thorsten to talk about the scheme we have today.
Oops. Yeah, so as Lisa mentioned, in 1962, the Northland Catchment Commission was formed, and they took over the drainage scheme in Hikurangi. And they designed a new scheme for the Hikurangi Swamp, which was called the Swamp Major Scheme, and the work started in 1969. And that scheme is still present today. We have this map at the museum. It's a model made by Colin Anderson, who worked for the Northland Catchment Commission. And he made that in 1965 to explain the farmers how the new drainage scheme would work. So if you come to the museum one day, that's a really good model. It's 3D and brilliant to look at. This map also explains, probably a little bit better for you, the scheme. So what they first did was to straighten the river. As Lisa said, they took out all these oxbows, which some of them are still visible nowadays in the landscape. And they put in stop banks on the side of the river, and they created 7 pockets, which you see are colored in here. And each of these pockets had a pump and a spillway. So how it worked was, if there was a massive rain event, was a lot of rain coming from the hillsides, the water in the river would fill up, and when it was kind of a little bit too high, it would go over the spillways into those pockets, and so just the pockets would fill up with water and not the whole swamp. And once the water in the river, the water level would sink down, they could pump or still can pump the water into the river again. So it's not sitting there for too long. Farmers say about, especially in summer and humid weather, the water shouldn't sit on the grass for longer than 3 days. Otherwise, it just rots away, and you have to regrass everything. So that was the whole idea, and well, this scheme is still in the swamp nowadays. There's a lot of a lot of discussion going on what to do with it. The Whangārei District Council wants to review the scheme. There is at the moment, they got funding from the Ministry of Internal Affairs to write a business case, and also how to carry on with this scheme. So there are a few problems connected to the scheme. One is, of course, tuna fertility. You might have heard about it, especially Mana Whenua raised that concerns about that. So the problem is, if there's a flood event, that's often at the time when the tuna starts to migrate to, and they have to go through the pumps to get to the main river, and they all get chopped up in the pumps.
There was supposed to be eel ladders put in 50 years ago.
Well, it never happened, so and yeah, so that's a big problem. And yeah, so this is one of the pump stations here when they put it in. Massive pumps. Another picture made by Merv Rusk. Yeah, so this is one of the major flooding events that happened in the swamp, the Cyclone Bola. You might remember that. That was in 1988. So that's the scheme was in there still, but you see, didn't really help, obviously. The whole swamp was a massive lake. There were other massive floods in 2007. You might remember that. There was a big flood. And 2020 was the last big flood, but there were heaps of other more floods in between. Yeah, so what's the future going to bring for this scheme? Well, as I said, the Whangārei District Town Council got funding to improve for an environmental improvement options and business case to develop this. Andrew Carvel is the main manager, the leading manager from the council, but they try to bring all the different stakeholders on board to discuss options for the future. So that means Mana Whenua, farmers and other people, local council workers and others to talk about options for the future. Climate change is of course a big factor. So we have more and more extreme weather events, and that also means that there will be more floods in the future coming, especially after a dry period of dry months, and then you have a lot of rain coming. The ground just can't absorb it anymore. There's also the water from the surrounding hillsides is running into the swamp much faster nowadays because of development. Everyone has a concrete driveway nowadays, and that all adds up. And it's just running down much faster. So the drainage scheme was designed in the 70s, and it's just not keeping up with the amount of water anymore. Another question which was raised is that there's, of course, a lot of peatland in the swamp. And when peatland dries out, it releases a lot of carbon dioxide, which is a big problem because carbon dioxide is one of the greenhouse gases. There are new studies from the University of Waikato, especially David Campbell did a study, just came out this year actually, that in New Zealand around about 8 to 10% of our net emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are coming from dried out peatlands, which is a lot if you think about it. And it's just 1.3% of agricultural land in New Zealand. So probably makes sense to think about to use these peatlands differently or even bring them back into wetlands. Another thing that happened just this year is one of the pumps got replaced by a gravity gate. That's one of an junction pocket. So that's the further in the north, one of the pockets. So that's another option to reduce eel fatalities, which is a good thing. Yeah, so I think we leave it by that. I just want to mention we have a few publications here where you can get a bit more information. So the True Tales of Hikurangi, that's a book one of our museum members edited, Bill Black. He couldn't make it today, unfortunately. There are a lot of stories from locals in there. There's also this book Don Goodall helped creating Amazing Pui Pui. There's another book about the swamp scheme and the floods in the swamp, created by Diane Menifee. She had an exhibition at the Hikuranui Museum, which is just up the road from us. And a few other publications. If you want to, please leave your name and an email address, and we can send out newsletters from the museum.
And Merv's book.
And yeah, there's a very good book from Merv Rusk. He wrote a massive book about the swamp scheme. He's probably one of the experts in that field. Yeah, and there are also a few postcards if you want to buy a postcard and support the museum. And of course, come around to the museum. We have a few pamphlets there. And we are open just 3 times a week, so Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday from 10 to 11:30, but we also open by appointment. That's quite important, so I think the time is off, so we make a stop here because we could keep on talking the whole day, but thanks for coming around and listening to the story of Hikurangi.
Questions?
Yeah, we have, I don't know what the time is. Oh, it's almost 12.
That's okay. We've got some time for some questions. If people have got any questions they'd like to ask.
Or want to share a story or something. It's just, yep.
How did it end up under the district council when the regional council were talking about the waterways and rivers and things? It doesn't sound quite right.
Do you want to answer that question?
No, I'm not sure. Is it? Yeah, the rates. Yeah, it's possibly to do with the rating. I don't know. We did in producing our exhibition. We did lots of interviews, and we had a fantastic interview, 4 hours long with what's his name?
I forgot his name.
Who used to be the chair of the Northland Catchment Commission. And he talks quite a bit about that transition and the work that they did. And so he's happy for that to be shared. So that's the sort of thing that we can make available at the museum if you want to come out and sit down and have a listen. Yeah, but good question. And if anyone else like Rosemary has something that you want us to go away and find out more about and get back to you, because as you can see, there's a lot more information that we could have shared that we haven't, that we probably have at our fingertips.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realise the Hikurangi Swamp used to actually drain out through the Whangārei River many, many years ago, before the upheaval at Aotearoa.
Yes.
And all through there.
Yeah. Yeah, that lava flow there as well. Yeah. And we also heard that when that got blocked, the area just filled up like a huge lake until it cut its course out near Matarau to go west. Yeah.
I think in an age of atmospheric rivers, sea warming, it's going to all go back to floodplain again. And that'll make the mana whenua happy because they'll get their tuna. And it'll make the fishermen of the Kaipara more happy because you won't get all those phosphates creating zombie fish in the biggest snapper spawning ground in the country. So Mother Nature, I think, always wins in the long run, and you can't rape the landscape.
Well, that's right.
Consequences.
And it's, as you said, it's all connected, so all the water from Hikurangi ends up in the Kaipara Harbour, so what happens up there is actually quite important for the people in the Kaipara Harbour too. Yes?
So what happens to that lake of mercury at the top?
Well, locals...
It's right up.
Yeah, I know. I've seen pictures of it. It's all dead around it, obviously, and I'm not quite sure what happens with it. I mean, locals raised concerns about it several times. I'm not sure what the council is doing.
We went to a hui at Whakapara that the doc had contracted someone to do a test toxicity survey, and they presented it, and I think that's available. They said it wasn't so much the lake itself, because we're obviously concerned. We live in Hikurangi. We don't want that ending up in our water or going out to the kaipara and people are eating it in their fish. But they said it was more is it the tailings that was more of concern than the water where that lake was. That was where the higher toxicity, the high mercury count was.
A question at the front of the view?
Yeah.
Did you have a
question?
Mine is more of a what if, really. I live on the edge of the swamp, and my question it relates a little bit to what this gentleman said about Mother Nature always wins in the end. That what if we had never tried to farm it in the first place? Yes. What if we hadn't done the same in the Esk Valley? What would our environment and our ecology and our economy look like if we'd allowed it to be how it was supposed to be? Because it's not just about the tuna, it's about the other wildlife and the plant species and the whole environment and part of who we are as Aotearoa that we've destroyed. And I think it's every now and again we have to ask ourselves what if, because we actually have an opportunity now to say, what if we allowed it to go back to be its natural place? I know that would affect a lot of people really badly because it would destroy their current lives. But what if we did that?
And I think it's a really valid comment. And one of the things that concerns me is that when the turn of the 20th century, the desire for arable land, for butterfat came from the national government, because it was for the resources for the whole of Aotearoa, for the country. And I think that if we are needing to look at solutions, local solutions, we shouldn't be having to find those resources ourselves at a local level, because we don't have the money necessarily to be able to, if say land needs to be retired in order to re-wet some of the peatlands, and that shouldn't be falling on local communities to do, when I feel it, this is my personal belief, when it was something that was a national mandate. We forget very quickly that there was this huge drive in terms of, it was considered a waste, it was a shame to let land sit there, and so, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they try to do with this new plan they develop, is to bring all the different groups together and not to work against each other. I think that's quite important to go into the future, to bring Mana Whenua, Farmer and all the other groups together and actually work together on a plan for the future. Because, I mean, let's face it, we can't live without farms, and we don't want to destroy the planet we are living on, so it's about finding compromises and to find a way together into the future. I think that's what's very important.